I'm Anne McElvoy. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, we have a programme of conundrums for you today. How do you film subject matter as elusive as the Large Hadron Collider and America's Death Row, and write a book about a film about an unattainable quest? To delve into all of this, we bring you a bunch of genre-bending iconoclasts. The American documentary maker Liz Mermin has been filming the search for antimatter at Switzerland's research centre CERN. The British writer Geoff Dyer's latest book Zona takes us into the virtual world of Tarkovsky's epic Russian film Stalker, with meditations on chalk ices and a childhood in Cheltenham along the way. Childhood Remembered is also at the heart of the poet Paul Farley's latest collection, The Dark Film, and later on he'll be telling us how to recreate a spectral world with only a box of half-eaten Quality Street to assist you. But we get underway with Werner Herzog, the German-born filmmaker who, in a career spanning over 4 decades, has spent time in secret caves, at the Antarctic, and in the steamy depths of the Peruvian jungle in pursuit of stories about the shaky edge of human experience. In his new documentary, Into the Abyss, A Tale of Life, A Tale of Death, he finds extreme circumstances closer to his home in the US, following a young prisoner on death row in Texas and excavating the crime behind it. Werner, your 2 main characters in this film are Michael Perry, you're on death row, and his partner in crime, who was called Jason Burkett, and he escaped the death penalty. It's not a film about whether they're innocent or guilty, is it?
Well, you see it quite often when you have films about death row cases that they try to exonerate them, or there are issue films, of course, which is quite legitimate, but I was not that much interested. By the way, in the case, the triple homicide perpetrated by Michael Perry, who was actually executed 8 days after I filmed with him, in Jason Burkett, this story, or this crazy, senseless crime, doesn't have any elements where you can really doubt the correctness of the guilty verdict. I personally am not an advocate of capital punishment, obviously, and I explain it to everyone. The perpetrators, whoever is in there, the prison guards know that I'm not an advocate of capital punishment, and it of course has to do with my historical and cultural background.
You mean as a German filmmaker? As
a German, yes. I would be the last one to tell the American people or the Chinese people or whoever how to handle their criminal justice. And when you speak about the German past, the Nazi barbarism, there was just an excessive amount of capital punishment. Parallel to that, a systematic program of euthanasia. If you were insane or retarded, you were considered worthless and they would execute you. And on top of it, a genocide. 6 million Jewish people. End of story. I don't even have an argument. It's just a story.
End of story, but also beginning of story for you here, because what you do in the film is dig back the layers and the levels that have led up to the crime, about the lives of those involved. But as you say, it's not advocacy, is it? You say at the beginning of the film to the guy on death row, I don't have to like you.
Yes, I sympathise with the fact that his childhood was terrible. But I tell him straight away, 120 seconds in our conversation, it does not exonerate you. And second, it does not necessarily mean that I have to like you. And I declare myself straight away. And the young man, he looks like a kid, like a lost kid. And he hesitates for a moment, and I knew after 120 seconds the film may have been over. So that I had to run the risk, but I'm really straightforward, and they all liked it a lot. Nobody talks to them like that.
Because it was straightforward.
Yes, the families are always commiserating, the attorneys are always upbeat, and nobody talks straight to them.
What we do see here, and you give the film a sort of subtitle of The Dark Side of Conroe as the side, this is the area in which it's filmed in rural Texas. We see trailer parks next to gated communities in this cheek-by-jowl world, which in the film clashes horribly in the murders. Was this also an attempt to excavate life in America as well as death?
In a way, yes. And of course, why I called it a tale of life and a tale of death. In the footage, all of a sudden, unbeknownst to me, there are elements where life has an incredible urgency, and a chapter in the film is about the urgency of life. For example, the wife of the second murderer, Burkett, she was only allowed to marry him with a glass wall in between them, separated. Now, since she is a legal wife, she's allowed to visit him and touch hands with him, and she is pregnant.
But not by touching hands, we assume.
Well, that's my question, and there seems to be an urgency of life. How does she become pregnant? It's a mystery. Of course, there is a clear theory how it happened. There's contraband entering the prisons, like drugs or cell phones or money or whatever, and there seems to be contraband coming out of prison. Let's formulate it that way. This is the
classic Werner Herzog edge of experience, isn't it, where we know that something has happened and it is part of normal life, and yet in the context it seems frankly bizarre. I mean, did you feel that she was obviously a rather credulous woman? Did you feel that this was, in a way you were having to sort of collude in this story about her becoming pregnant by a man who's in prison for triple homicide? I mean, some people might think it's a bit morally distasteful.
Of course, and I leave it uncommented, but you as an audience can make your clear conclusions. And I think what is significant about the film is not so much death penalty or so, it's more a deep look into some deep, dark recesses of the human soul. And by the way, quite a few of my films could have had the same title. Aguirre, the Wrath of God could have been Into the Abyss, or The Great Ecstasy of the Sculptor Steiner could have been a film with the same title, or even the Cave film, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, could have had the same title.
Paul, The Cave of Dreams was a poetic quest for the core of humanity, and this is an altogether tougher view of what we're capable of.
I was fascinated by when you were in that cave, going back to the Chauvet cave, when you noticed bison had 8 legs instead of 4 legs, and
yes.
you could imagine early man holding a flickering tallow flame up to one of these animals, and it would almost animate it. And
yes.
I think in the film you describe it as a kind of proto-cinema.
Yeah.
So fascinating that you were going back 300 centuries before Plato in his cave, and there are people making making things move and delighting in that. I found that wonderful.
Well, there's also strange cultural memories, bits and pieces of deep into prehistory. 32,000 years ago, we have a bison with 8 legs, apparently to show how fast this bison is. And when you look at old Nordic mythology, the main god Wotan or Odin has a horse, Sleipnir, and Sleipnir is so fast that Sleipnir has 8 legs. I heard about this only after I had finished the film. Of course, I would have included Sleipnir into the commentary of the film. But
the film had legs anyway.
Strange things that somehow float towards us, and they stay alive in a strange memory of culture.
Geoff, you're also something of a genre bender in the way that you write. This film is documentary style, but it does tell a very precise story, a sort of Dostoevskian tale of life and death. It's not easy to categorise.
Yeah, that's right. And it's what I wanted to ask Werner, actually. He's been quite frank in the past about some of his documentaries whereby the people, his subjects, have said things in the films that Werner has scripted for them. And there was a bit right at the beginning of the new film where there's the chaplain, and he tells this incredibly Herzogian parable about how he's on the golf course and he comes to a stop on his cart just before he runs over a squirrel. So a question was that you or him?
That was him. I actually saw him only 25 minutes in my entire life. And he came and had to go straight away to the death chamber to assist an inmate during his execution. And he started to speak like a TV preacher, very superficial, phony, about how beautiful God's creation is and a forgiving, merciful God and paradise for everyone. And he sees a squirrel at the golf course, and sometimes a deer looks at him, and I stop him. And I ask a question that nobody else probably would have asked. I ask him with his cheerful voice, "Tell me about an encounter with a squirrel."
And he does.
And he comes apart. All of a sudden it rips his chest open. We see deep into his heart. He unravels, almost starts to cry. But you have to have the right tone, the right tool. What do you ask him? How do you shake him out of this kind of security? But let's face it, if necessary, I would have invented some dialogue in order to reach a deeper stratum of truth. And it may sound like a paradox, but it is not, and I do believe...
Would that have been all right in a film about something as sensitive as death penalty?
Death penalty, no, I wouldn't do it. I have to deal... Yes, I have to deal with people who are facing execution, so you just don't do it. But in other films, yes, I become inventive, and in the film Cave of Forgotten Dreams, there are radioactive albino mutant crocodiles. And, of course, they're partially an invention. They're not even crocodiles, but...
I'd like to bring Liz in here. Liz, we're coming to your films a little bit later on, but you do share a desire with Werner, don't you, to gain an insight into immortality?
Well, I suppose there are different kinds of mortality or different kinds of living beings. I guess what struck me in the film was the Reverend at the beginning, the chaplain, and of course the guy at the end who straps them down. And you really get a sense that everyone else is living through their own experience and doesn't quite, our sense of life and death is mediated by their own personal experience and their family, obviously, as most of us are. And there's this way that those two who have just sat there watching death after death after death and participating in them and grab you on a different plane. I mean, I felt those moments really did something where the personal ones kind of are more personal storytelling. I was just wondering about the difference and how, I mean, I thought it was beautifully integrated. But
the subject itself is obvious. You can't avoid that. It's a very, very intense film. It was so intense, actually, that both my editor and I started smoking again during editing. It sounds funny, but we had to rush out. We could only work 5 hours a day. So it's very intense, and I also try to find something, again, back to facts and in the deeper form of truth. I'm trying to find something which I call the ecstasy of truth, an ecstatic truth, something that illuminates you deep inside of you.
Well, with 40 films under his belt, documentaries and feature films, of course, Werner once said you never make a distinction between the two. They're all just films. But we're sorely tempted to put films and books into categories, and Geoff Dyer's latest work, Zona, gives the booksellers and librarians a bit of a challenge on that one. The subtitle is, deep breath here, Book About a Film, About a Journey into a Room. It does need a bit of unravelling. Geoff, why did Tarkovsky's 1979 film Stalker, the heart of this book, have such an impact on you?
I've seen it more than any other film, except maybe The Great Escape and Where Eagles Dare, which I've tended to see on TV, whereas this is a film which in the days before everything became available at the click of a button, I would always see in the cinema. So it became the film is about this place called the Zone that they go to, and going to see this film over the years became a kind of pilgrimage that I'd undertake in various cities. But the short answer to your question is because I really do think it's one of, if not the greatest film ever made, and it certainly moved me more profoundly than any other film I've seen.
This film was seen as a kind of contraband when I was living in the old East Germany, because sci-fi and allegory about sci-fi, which it sort of is, I think. You can tell us what you think, but that was a way of escaping socialist realism. Is it really a film about the Soviet Union, or is it about something more?
It's about so much. I mean, it's not a film about the Gulag, but it's everywhere haunted by the ghosts of the Gulag. So the stalker, the main character in it, he looks like a Zek, somebody who's been through the camps, and even this word Zona has those sort of echoes of the Gulag. But just to summarise the film very quickly, so Stalker takes these two people, writer and professor, into this zone at the heart of which is a room where it's alleged your deepest wishes will come true. And the remarkable thing about this zone, which is it's unbelievably beautiful the way it's photographed, and you sort of believe that it has these magical properties, and at the same time it's totally ordinary. Now, and the crucial thing there is at the same time it's simultaneously just this sort of abandoned place on the edge of a town, and it's this completely mystical, wonderful place with these life-changing powers.
But your approach to it is a bit like Tristram Shandy asked to do a film review. The digressions are multiple, the footnotes are often rather longer than the thing that they set out to describe. So obviously it was plucking all sorts of emotional chords with you.
Yeah, the digressions though are they're kind of very direct as well, because in the film, at one point, writer, who I identify with totally, he's this sort of griping, fed-up person. He says, "Why can't we just go straight to the room? You know, it's only about 200 yards away." And the stalker tells him, "Oh no, you've got to go. We've got to." They go on this incredibly roundabout route. So
have you never read about a quest?
Yeah, so it would be really inappropriate if I'd not gone on these huge digressions. And the digressions are in the form of these footnotes, which gradually, again in a way that seems to me entirely appropriate to the film, they kind of grow up the page like ivy on the sort of crumbling walls of a building.
You take us at one point into your childhood and discussion about your father not wanting to pay for overpriced chalk ices and seeing films in Cheltenham where you grew up. Isn't that because this is one of those films that you start out watching it as a linear narrative and then somehow it awakens all sorts of ghosts and half-remembered things within you?
Yeah, one of the some people say this film is boring. I mean, I don't think it is boring. And the reason it's not boring is because it describes a journey. And as soon as you've got a journey, you've got automatic narrative interest. So, you know, it was contemporaneous with Apocalypse Now, another journey to a sort of incredible place. But for me, growing up in Cheltenham, I was born in 1958. So all over the edges of towns, there were these kind of these semi-abandoned. There were 4 railway stations when I was born, and then by the time I was 4 or 5 there was only one. So there were these. The landscape depicted in Stalker was I realised as I watched the film again and again, I realised it was perhaps not for nothing that this landscape had appealed to me so much, because it was very familiar to me from my childhood, not in Russia but in the Midwest of England, Cheltenham, Gloucestershire.
Paul Farley is the co-author of Edgelands, a book which I remember enjoying very much, about the edge of Britain's urban landscapes. Did this strike a chord with you in a Soviet context?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I saw Stalker in 1986 for the first time, and I remember when I first saw it bore more than a passing resemblance to the Lancashire of the 1970s where I grew up. I think you mentioned Last of the Summer Wine at one point as well, with these 3 characters on the trolley look like Compo and Co. So absolutely, and that abandonment and these places as places where, because there is this total inattention, people aren't looking, especially for children, the places where the imagination can truly be exercised, and they're separate from the adult world, and they're places where you can build dens, and they're places that have their own discrete rules as well. So in that way, Edgelands are zones, or the zone is Edgelands.
Yeah, I'm glad you've mentioned Last of the Summer Wine, because I had a query from both the Americans and the German translator saying they didn't get this reference. Could we remove it? But it seemed to me so important that I wasn't talking about Tarkovsky all the time in the kind of addressing him as sort of Saint Andrei Tolstoyevsky in this reverential tone. So I felt this was in a way more revealing.
Werner, you're actually cited in this book for some of your own writings about Tarkovsky's one filmmaker on another. Tarkovsky?
Very hard to to answer that one. But of course, what I like about the book in that it has to do with memories of a film. Sometimes apparently you misquote the film. You don't care. You are not pedantic at all. And all of a sudden the footnotes seem to be a parallel sort of layer. It's not subdued in tiny font at the bottom or so. The footnotes take over, and memories that are not verified by the film itself all of a sudden seem to be taking over. And all of a sudden you describe a film on a variety of levels. And I like that you see Tarkovsky like that, because I think you can view his films only on a variety of levels. It's not a linear sort of experience that you would have in a regular Hollywood feature film.
I think you once said that the images in Tarkovsky develop their own mysterious stardom.
It's true, yes. There is something very strange and very inexplicable. And I do understand that Geoff is somehow addicted to the film.
Addicted is a very, very good word. But Liz, you might even feel a certain similarity with this enterprise, because neither in the case of CERN nor Tarkovsky in this film are we sure what we're going to get in the end.
Yes, well, I guess that's, I mean, the challenge, isn't it, to keep the faith, and you keep going and looking at it. But I guess what I was taken by with Geoff's book was, I mean, knowing Geoff's work and knowing Tarkovsky, there's such a contrast, because Geoff is so discursive and thoughtful and recurrent, and Tarkovsky is so quiet and open and empty. And what really struck me was, of course, and loving films about sort of silent, empty, breathing spaces, and trying as much as one can in the horrible world of TV to make little things like that. Of course, what it is that draws you into these incredible landscapes is a lot of what's going on in your head, and it is about, this space to open up a whole thought path that's very, very personal. And these kind of incredible journeys you go on in films like this, and they do mean something so different to each person. So actually, I found myself thinking, well, this is a strangely appropriate, even though it seems like such a odd thing to do, kind of merging these styles. And then, of course, what it does is it kicks off your own memories and your own sort of what you find in those spaces that Tarkovsky leaves you, because it kicks off something in your brain, that staring at these images.
And that became the reason that happened is because actually I'd seen the film so often, and when I was writing the book I deliberately wasn't watching the film the whole time, so there's all sorts of bits where the film diverges from the reality of what's on screen.
Well, if you're a filmmaker or a novelist, you'll want to keep us glued to the screen or the page, or possibly in Geoff's case both at once. Whereas poetry I tend to think of as something we can dip into and read more episodically. And I started out reading Paul Farley's new collection that way, and then realised I'd tumbled headlong into Paul's world of decrepit British substations and down-at-heel seaside resorts. But they have a quality of passing time and very familiar things, even if we've never been to the places Paul is describing. What takes us there, Paul?
Well, I know what takes me there. It's a generic landscape anyway, and like we were talking about earlier with Geoff's zone, these places are to be found on the edges of most major cities and conurbations. So it's a landscape that's, even if it's not looked into, we know what this place is. The reason I'm so fascinated with it is because of a move. Our family moved from the city centre, from the middle of Liverpool, to the edge of Liverpool when I was about 5. And it was everything was new. We moved out of this old house that was kind of vermin infested, and to this new space, which was wonderful. It was right on the edge of rural Lancashire. It was where the city ended. So it was a huge playground, and it smelt new, and physically it was full of half-built, half-finished things. But even then, even at a very tender age, I remember feeling nostalgic for this older space we'd left behind, this dirtier, scuzzier, more textured, older space.
And what I liked about the ending of that poem is the nostalgia for that is then built into the end. The child knows it can't last, even as he's celebrating it and king of all he surveys. It has a lot in common with cinema, seeing as we've had a cinematic theme on the programme up to now. I'm just thinking about the poem Quality Street, where the child does what we've all done and takes those marvellous multicoloured wrappers of cellophane and becomes his own cinematographer.
We have all done it, haven't we? I go around doing readings, and I've only just started reading this poem very recently. And as soon as I look up and say, you know, come on, you've done this too, haven't you? Everybody nods and finds out they're in the secret majority. And in fact, we all turned ourselves into a kind of rudimentary camera and did this thing to our perception, turned the world to monochrome. It's interesting as well, we talk about looking at the past with rose-coloured spectacles. But what about being in the past and looking at the world through a filter and projecting yourself forwards and backwards?
Chocolate rose-coloured spectacles. Werner, I doubt that you've looked at the world through a Quality Street wrapper, seeing as you didn't grow up in Britain, but is that the instinct of every budding filmmaker, to look at things through different lenses and prisms and try it out?
Not necessarily. I grew up without any technology. I had no idea what a telephone was. I made my first phone call when I was 17. I didn't know that cinema existed until I was 11. Not only that I hadn't seen films, I didn't even know that cinema existed. So now I had to invent the world with my friends, and we had to invent our games and our toys and our tools and everything. And in a way, I always had the feeling, until today, by the way, as odd as it may sound, that I'm the inventor of cinema, as if there were no other filmmakers, and I hardly ever see any. I hardly see films, maybe 2-3 per year as an average, not more. But I do read. I read poetry. I read poetry, and I have my own film school, the Rogue Film School, a wild guerrilla style sort of thing. And I have a mandatory reading list for them, and it starts with Virgil's Georgics.
Right.
Is it going to have Paul Farley on it from now on? What did you respond to that?
Yes, I have read not all of it. I've spent a pretty much sleepless night being jet-lagged to look at Geoff Dyer's Zona and, of course, at Paul Farley's The Dark Film. And it sounds both are extraordinary books, really wonderful. And I think much of it also, Geoff's book has to do a lot with strange, mysterious poetry.
There's a fascination in your poems with the ordinary, isn't there? There is this mystery, but there's also an ordinariness. The years of watching TV as a child and being bored, that feeling of lying on the rug by the gas fire. But give us a flavour of it, perhaps, from the spoiler, the physicality of it.
Surely. The spoiler. The spoiler wouldn't ever reveal its ends to me, would never speak of rivers flowing into the sea, or let slip how the boy would get the girl. It said that I should look away or cover my ears instead. But then the spoiler peeled its gloves off, and I felt the rough skin of the world those silky hands had built.
You've been compared to Larkin and Henry Harrison in having a northern poetic voice, and that's the world that you describe here. But do you feel distinctively northern?
I feel as though I grew up amongst a bunch of people who aren't really there anymore. I feel like it's a kind of lost tribe. There's a poem in the book actually called "The Airbrake People" that is almost anthropological in the way it remembers and looks back at the traces that these people have left. And I don't know what's distinctly northern. I really don't know. But they were my people, but I don't feel like they're there anymore. I think something's happened to them, and something's happened to me as well, and there's a distance between us and between all of us now.
Geoff, there are so many shared childhood references in these poems. Did you feel that it was reaching out beyond? It's got a very clear regional voice, but at the same time it's got a universal quality.
Yeah, I think I'm about 5 years older than Paul, but he accesses this kind of, I don't know, almost universal unconscious of childhood, but does it through very specific things like that great description of the diamond adder frayed flecks of the iron. But in terms of, now I'm going to do that dreadful thing of telling Paul where I think he's coming from. I think he's a sort of second generation Martian. That Martian school where the Martian sends a postcard home. It's we associate it with Craig Rain. Paul is sort of second generation, both the generation after that, and also a Martian in the sense that he was sort of born on this planet and educated here and all this sort of stuff, but retains some of that sense of how incredibly weird everything is, even though it has this great familiarity. So what genius to have a dramatic monologue spoken by one of those models that we see in barbershops, you know, the guys with their hair and they've all turned slightly blue. It's in the poem called Cyan, isn't it? Do you think are you a Martian?
Am I a Martian? I mean, it was like being sent to Mars at age 5. It's strange. This estate, this brutalist modernist estate, was just so different from everything I was just getting used to. And I was just at that very receptive age, and it just I can't tell you what an effect it had on me. The other thing was glasses. I didn't realise I was myopic until I was quite old. So I would sit at the front of the class, the blackboard. We used to read in bed with the tortoise. I ruined my eyes through reading. And at the cinema, I always had to be at the front where it was very enveloping. And the first time I put a pair of glasses on, I mean, I can't tell you how I was kind of ecstatic. I could see clouds. I could see the pointing in brickwork. Just these ridiculous, I mean, everyday details, but I could see them, and it's never really left me.
Myopia is a pre-existing condition for poetry. Liz, there's a very cinematic quality to some of this writing, isn't there? There's jump cuts, changes of perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, and it's all the poems are full of cinema memoirs. Again, I was struck, and I suppose partly because of the context that I was reading it with Zona, but that. The wonderful anthropomorphizing that you do throughout the book with different poems. And as you were reading, spoiler, I glimpsed the cellar and remembered how much that had struck me. And this idea of making a cellar of a house into a character and having it think about what's going on in the other rooms. There's something really gripping about these things that you find to give life to. And especially having recently rewatched Stalker for this program, and that strange sense of life in the landscape.
I did used to animate things. I mean, just it was mostly boring childhood, and so just that quality of attention, just spending a long time looking at very ordinary things and seeing right into them, has never really left me. I mean, I didn't realise at the time, but it was good training. It really was for a poet.
I think so many people will read it and think, oh, thank goodness someone else feels that about a railway track or an electric substation where you want to be laid to rest, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer what Tom Waite said. Tom Waite said he'd like to be creamed. I'd prefer that. But for the purposes of the poem, lay me to rest in an electricity substation. It goes back to what Werner was saying. To tell the truth, I lied a little. And sometimes you have to adjust what really happened. In order to get to a deeper truth, which is the truth we're really interested in.
I don't lie a little. I invent and I stylize, and it's very clear that there's a stylization which leads us to some deeper truth. But I'd like to make one remark. I don't think that you're a second generation alien simply because you are describing landscapes that we are not familiar with and they are just around us. You just name the magnificence of it. And you know what? It reminds me of convicts who are going to be executed. They're on death row, but the death chamber where they die is only 40 miles away. And one inmate who was 23 minutes away from execution speaks about this last trip of 43 miles. And he says it was like Israel, like the Holy Land. And all of a sudden the shittiest of Texas, rural Texas, becomes the Holy Land.
Well, Paul Farley's poems are often very concise, but I would like to move to a different sort of meditation on truth now, which excels in brevity, and that's Liz Mermin's short films recorded at the CERN Research Centre in Switzerland, where the Large Hadron Collider may or may not be about to yield up the secrets of the Higgs boson God particle. Liz, you've been given access to CERN for a year, and at the end of it you will make a documentary, but in the meantime you're posting these moments on the internet, sort of 2 to 3 minute insights into what's going on to lure us in.
Yes, this is a new thing for me, and I have to say I'm really enjoying it, because something like CERN it's a place. The first time I went there was about a year ago, and there's something going on there and you can't quite figure it out. It's not that impressive. It's all these kind of dreary 1960s buildings. Obviously and admirably, all the money's being spent underground. And you think, well, this is really kind of dreary, and it's a bunch of people fenced in, a bunch of physicists sort of eating in the same cafeteria. And every conversation you go by, it's this feeling you have little whispers. You hear traces of conversations about, you know, subatomic particles, and everyone's talking.
These people have antimatter for
for
breakfast, really.
I mean, they really are obsessives. You have to be to get to that level. And thinking, how the hell do you turn this into a film? But at the same time, there was this sort of visceral excitement of being there. And these short films have been a wonderful opportunity to try to capture little bits of that in a way that will really help build up a bigger film, but also, you know, thinking about, all right, well, I'll take this tiny point and try to explain it here, and then this tiny point.
They're very much character-driven because the actual experimental gear looks like parts you might get at the local Quick Fit. They're big and a bit sort of clunky and mechanical. The real work is in the equations and in the mind.
Well, what's extraordinary to me, I guess, and what draws me into this subject, and I still, you know, the luxury of figuring it out as you go along, is that on the one hand, what these people are working with is, you know, mind-numbingly abstract. The physics, it's really, I mean, it's theories based on very high-level mathematics and, you know, nothing but thought that it has done over the last, you know, century, an extraordinary job of figuring out how the world we inhabit actually works. I mean, it's just mind-blowing when you think about what they've been able to figure out in their heads with equations. And then the other extreme are those are the theorists, and then we've got these experimentalists at CERN who are actually figuring out how to make antimatter or recreate the conditions of the Big Bang. And when you dive into, when you dive into what they're doing, it's incredibly practical, some degrees on such a mundane level. I mean, you know, stripping wire off connectors and suddenly realizing you have the wrong size bolt and you've got to create your antimatter trap, and where are you going to find the right bolt before the antiprotons start getting fired again. And
there is sometimes an unwitting comedy in the way that they talk about it, isn't it?
Yes.
Oh, we've been here 14 hours and we still haven't got going on
Right.
the antimatter.
Exactly.
It's just been a long day at the coalface.
And there's a wonderful one of the characters who leads the antimatter team one of the incredible physicists, the danger of filmmakers calling everyone characters. But, you know, he just sort of says with this boyish smile, it's kind of amazing nature said there shouldn't be any antimatter, and we've got it hanging out down there. You know, after almost 30 years, they managed to create an atom of antihydrogen, and then they managed to hold it for long enough, 16 minutes, an eternity, to actually try to do something with it. But of course, antihydrogen, it annihilates the moment. So it's being held by these magnet walls, and I mean, just the actual practical challenge of what they're doing. They're kind of guys with wrenches, but they're dealing at the highest level of abstraction we can imagine.
You do seem fascinated by the elusive, in a very similar way perhaps to Werner, in that you've done documentaries on Indian office workers, Irish racehorses, now physicists. Not obvious choices for the documentary maker to point a camera at.
Well, I think that there's a way in which I try not to go over the same ground twice, although when you look back at what you've done, you've been stealing from yourself all the time, I guess. But, I mean, this is going to be an incredibly difficult film to make, and the little films are almost training grounds and testing grounds, and finding, different people who really come up with surprising ways to talk about what they're doing. And in a way, I've always been inspired by Werner's work, but often I find myself, I was trained in observational filmmaking, which is all about watching and images speaking. And then I realized many of the films that I found most moving and amazing it's just in the way people describe the world and certain things that people say and what comes out of interviews. And so in a way, that's what I'm trying to do with these people.
Paul, Liz is trying to capture the business of thinking and researching at the heights of our present knowledge. That's a pretty big ask for film, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the two things I was struck with, one was how young they all were, or most of them were, and this sense of them being in some kind of Olympic village of the mind out there in Geneva or outside Geneva. And then yet the hands-onness of it. So that they're looking, these are particle physicists who are looking for things like Higgs boson, and they look like they're changing the plug on a kettle. I was really taken aback by that.
Geoff, the intellectual triple jump being filmed.
Yeah, that's right. I've been interested in antimatter ever since the Fantastic Four first made their first trip into the negative zone when I was a kid. And the thing about the negative zone that the Fantastic Four went in, it was this amazing, psychedelic, wonderful, visually astounding place. And I love this contrast between the humdrumness that these people, and they're also working as roadies. And I also love the kind of problem that you've got, what Hollywood calls a third act problem, that they might not find this thing that all the energy has been, all the initiative has been directed to.
Did that bother you as a filmmaker?
Well, no, the thing is that this year, if they don't find it, and that was the first thing when I went there, everyone said the best thing is if we don't find it, because then we really, one of them says it in one of the first films, if we don't find the Higgs boson, then we really don't know anything. Then we start all over again. The experiments kind of, the experimentalists.
We're back to the zone, really, aren't we?
No, they rub their hands together with glee at this idea of not finding what's predicted by these theorists. And so in a way, it's a PR problem that everything hinges on the Higgs boson, but actually it'll be much more exciting if they don't find it.
Werner, not finding things.
Well, that's a wonderful side of our existence, and it keeps us curious, it keeps us going, and it keeps us striving for something that we have never seen, planets that we have never even thought of, and particles that are mysterious and will remain mysterious, and sometimes it comes down to very simple facts, like from CERN, I think they shot neutrinos to Gran Sasso in the Abruzzi Mountains, and they believed that there was speed, that they traveled at a speed higher than the speed of light. And it turns out that some cable was not properly connected and kind of loose. Very banal things. They took the wrenches and fixed it now. And it seems to be clear that there is no speed higher than the speed of light, which gives me a lot of comfort.
Something at least might be certain. Well, that's it today from the mysterious world of antimatter, and thank you to all my guests. You can see Liz Mermin's short film on YouTube. Just look for CERN People. Werner Herzog's Into the Abyss, A Tale of Death, A Tale of Life is on selected release. Geoff Dyer's Zona, a book about a film, about a journey into a room, is out now, and Paul Farley's new collection, The Dark Film, will be out in a couple of weeks. Next week, Andrew Marr's back in his old seat, trying to work out what happened to socialism, with Alwyn Turner, Tristram Hunt, Janet Daly and Martin Rowson. But from now, goodbye from all of us. It's not a film about whether they're innocent or guilty, is it?
Well, you see it quite often when you have films about death row cases that they try to exonerate them, or they are issue films, of course, which is quite legitimate, but I was not that much interested, by the way, in the case, the triple homicide perpetrated by Michael Perry, who was actually executed 8 days after I filmed with him in Jason Burkett. This story, or this crazy, senseless crime, doesn't have any elements where you can really doubt the correctness of the guilty verdict. I personally am not an advocate of capital punishment, worthless, and they would execute you, and on top of it a genocide, 6 million Jewish people. End of story. I don't even have an argument. It's just a story.
End of story, but also beginning of story for you here, because what you do in the film is dig back the layers and the levels that have led up to the crime, about the lives of those involved. But as you say, it's not advocacy, is it? You say at the beginning of the film to the guy on death row, I don't have to like you.
Yes, I sympathise with the fact that his childhood was terrible. But I tell him straight away, 120 seconds in our conversation, it does not exonerate you. And second, it does not necessarily mean that I have to like you. And I declare myself straight away in punishment, obviously, and I explain it to everyone. The perpetrators, whoever is in there, the prison guards know that I'm not an advocate of capital punishment. And it, of course, has to do with my historical and cultural background.
You mean as a German filmmaker? As
a German, yes. I would be the last one to tell the American people or the Chinese people or whoever how to handle their criminal justice. And when you speak about the German past, the Nazi barbarism, there was just an excessive amount of capital punishment. Parallel to that, a systematic program of euthanasia. If you were insane or retarded, you were considered.
Poet Paul Farley's latest collection, The Dark Film, and later on he'll be telling us how to recreate a spectral world with only a box of half-eaten Quality Street to assist you. But we get underway with Werner Herzog, the German-born filmmaker who, in a career spanning over 4 decades, has spent time in secret caves, at the Antarctic, and in the steamy depths of the Peruvian jungle in pursuit of stories about the shaky edge of human experience. In his new documentary, Into the Abyss, A Tale of Life, A Tale of Death, he finds extreme circumstances closer to his home in the US, following a young prisoner on death row in Texas and excavating the crime behind it. Werner, your 2 main characters in this film are Michael Perry, you're on death row, and his partner in crime, who was called Jason Burkett, and he escaped the death penalty. I'm Anne McElvoy. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, we have a programme of conundrums for you today. How do you film subject matter as elusive as the Large Hadron Collider and America's death row, and write a book about a film about an unattainable quest? To delve into all of this, we bring you a bunch of genre-bending iconoclasts. The American documentary maker Liz Mermin has been filming the search for antimatter at Switzerland's research centre CERN. The British writer Geoff Dyer's latest book Zona takes us into the virtual world of Tarkovsky's epic Russian film Stalker, with meditations on chalk ices and a childhood in Cheltenham along the way. Childhood Remembered is also at the heart of the